My landlord watches me sleep, and I think I actually like it. He knew what I ate for dinner. He texted me when a storm was coming. He even knew that I had moved a tiny photograph on my nightstand the night before. When I asked how, he smiled with dead eyes and said, "Cameras, the whole building. I'm always watching." Everyone else would call it kidnapping. But when the underworld came for my head, his dark obsession was the only thing keeping me alive.
Let us open on a wide shot of Boston, swallowed by 3 days of freezing rain. The city is a gray purgatory. In the center of the frame stands Elena. Her cheap boots are soaked through as she stares up at an imposing Beacon Hill brownstone, a flawless fortress of red brick. She clutches a shattered phone. Her final lifeline before eviction dumps her onto the streets. You and I have seen this tragic arc play out before. Exhaustion breaks the human spirit, making a 2 a.m. rental listing feel like a miracle instead of a mirage. When the owner replied instantly, she did not even pause to question it. It is a simple, heavy truth of life. Desperation acts as the ultimate blindfold, completely stripping away our natural caution when we are backed into the darkest corners of survival. The message glowing on her broken screen was explicit. Arrive tomorrow at exactly 3 p.m. and come entirely alone. In any rational state of mind, this isolation is a glaring warning sign. Yet, when you are 26, grinding through double shifts in a diner thick with the smell of burnt coffee, the primal instinct to survive simply overwrites logic. It is a quiet tragedy how the crushing feature of tomorrow forces us to ignore the flashing alarms right in front of our eyes. She drags her exhausted frame up those immaculate stone steps, unnerved by the sterile perfection of the architecture. Her hand trembles as it hovers over the buzzer. She expects a tired, greedy landlord looking for a quick payout. Instead, the heavy oak door sweeps open to reveal the true architect of her fate. The man filling the doorway is no ordinary landlord. He radiates the terrifying, heavy gravity of a syndicate boss. Barely into his 30s, he is draped in dark wool woven from wealth so immense it eclipses her entire yearly wage. His polished shoes mirror the weeping gray sky above. But his face commands the camera, a sharp, unforgiving jawline and pitch-black eyes that dissect her worth in a single sweep. He possesses that effortless, lethal magnetism designed to lure intelligent minds into devastating traps. We must remember a vital lesson here. An attractive surface is often the most effective camouflage for the brutal danger. Lurking beneath, he fixes his dark gaze upon her and simply states that she is late. His voice is a low threat, laced with a heavy, unyielding accent. Elena scrambles to check her fractured screen. The numbers read exactly 3:02 p.m. She stammers a breathless defense, arguing that a mere 2 minutes means absolutely nothing. His response is swift and glacial. He informs her that in his brutal world, a 2-minute delay equates to a death sentence. This is the violent collision of her ordinary struggle and his lethal reality. Every biological impulse screams at her to run back into the freezing rain, yet the grand foyer radiates a seductive warmth. It is a profound human flaw, and a lesson we often learn too late, that our craving for comfort can so easily silence the warnings of our own intuition. She crosses the threshold, and the heavy door seals her fate behind her, trapping the thick scent of cedar and metallic danger. He commands her to the 3rd floor, sweeping past her toward a grand staircase without a backward glance. Men of his violent pedigree do not request compliance. They simply assume it. When poverty hollows you out, you surrender your autonomy without raising a fist. The contrast between them is stark. Her soaked boots slap against the cold marble, while his steps absorb into absolute silence. The architecture reveals its paranoid nature, with cameras observing from shadowed corners. Passing an armed sentry on the 2nd landing, The metaphor becomes literal. Life teaches us that giving up our power rarely happens all at once. It slips away step by step. She is no longer just a struggling tenant, but a captive walking willingly into the den of a predator. Every raw instinct firing within Elena warns that she is stepping into a meticulously laid trap. The boss easily reads the terror written across her stiff posture. In a terrifyingly flat cadence, he reveals that the suite belonged to his recently deceased mother, and he merely requires a quiet presence to occupy the space. There is no tremor of sorrow in his delivery. Yet, we must recognize a painful truth about grief. The most agonizing heartbreak is often buried beneath the absolute coldest stoicism a person can project. Reaching the top landing, he turns a vintage brass key, opening a heavy door with ghostly silence. To enter, Elena must press close to his imposing frame. Paralyzed by the violent capability radiating from the terrifying lack of distance between them. Stick with me here, because you and I must the brilliant framing of this moment. The air inside the suite is thick with the scent of winter frost and fine whiskey. Elena stands paralyzed, overwhelmed by the crushing gravity of the owner. The space is a masterpiece of design. Gleaming hardwood floors, heavy blackout drapes, and shelves burdened with rare Italian literature. Her voice fractures as she nervously questions the illusion. How could a luxury penthouse command a mere $800? Leaning against the doorframe, he coldly replies that he knows exactly what the property is worth. This reveals a timeless, brutal lesson about our lives. The most devastating traps never look like iron cages. They arrive perfectly disguised as a miraculous, impossible stroke of luck. His rumbling baritone shatters the quiet, demanding to know if the space meets her needs. Elena pivots, absorbing the crisp linens, the porcelain basin, and the thick glass, holding back the freezing storm. It is the absolute absence of decay. This is the sanctuary she desperately manifested during those soul-draining shifts, pouring coffee for strangers. Her defensive armor shatters. She whispers her surrender, calling the room perfect. He instantly claims the deal is sealed. When she nervously inquires about credit checks, he dismisses the civilian protocol entirely. He operates on a different moral axis. It is a haunting lesson we all must learn. Severe desperation will always blind a starving soul to the deadly, invisible strings attached to a sudden miracle. Pushing off the doorframe, he glides toward her with the silent grace of an apex predator. He dictates his twisted commandments: pay the toll, respect the sanctuary, and never probe into the shadows. He halts a mere 3 feet away, close enough to reveal the violent scar dividing his brow. With chilling smoothness, he asks if she can manage that, addressing her directly as Elena. Ice floods her veins. She stammers that she never offered her name. He flashes a hollow smile, claiming she wrote it on the application. She knows for a fact she left it blank. We are forcefully reminded of a chilling life lesson. True terror is not the unknown. It is realizing the predator has already mapped out your entire life, long before you ever stepped into the clearing. Elena desperately demands to know his identity, attempting to claw back a fraction of control. His response is a masterclass in psychological dominance. He coldly labels himself a simple landlord who despises repeating his words. As his hand slips into his coat, Elena braces for the worst, her mind flashing to the missing women swallowed by the city. But the weapon he draws is made of paper, a folded, ironclad lease. He offers a brutal choice: sign the document or return to the frozen misery of her former life. The flat tone of his voice is paralyzing as he starts a 30-second countdown. This scene holds a profound lesson about the human condition. Our logic often screams at us to run, but the intoxicating lure of sudden salvation will always anchor our trembling feet to the floor. At a glance, the document masquerades as a standard agreement. Yet, buried in the fine print lies a sinister clause demanding absolute silence regarding the owner and any suspicious activities. When she challenges the nature of these activities, he merely drops the countdown to 20 seconds. She protests again, and he ruthlessly slices the timer to 15. 10, 9, 8. The pressure in the room is suffocating. Let us pause and look at this together, because here lies a bitter truth we all must eventually face in life. Elena envisions the brutal eviction notice. The most defining choices in our lives are rarely a noble battle between good and evil. We are usually just forced to embrace the lesser of two absolute nightmares. The apartment wraps around her like an illusion of safety as the countdown bleeds away. 5, 4. Driven by pure survival, Elena snatches the pen, guards paper with a panic signature. The boss retrieves the contract, inspects the ink, and gives a chilling nod. Welcome home, Elena. He promises his men will move her belongings tonight. Turning toward the exit, he lets a heavy silence stretch across the room before delivering his law. If you see something, it vanishes. If you hear something, it never existed. We must understand the tragic life lesson woven into this climax. True sanctuary in a broken world always demands a terrible toll. Her physical safety was secured, but only because she agreed to become completely blind to the terrifying monsters operating right next door. Let us look closely at Elena, framed against the cold living room window. The heavy oak door clicks shut, sealing the trap. Alessandro does not yell. He leans in, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, warning that breaking his rules voids the lease. She nods rapidly, swallowing her terror. He calls her a good girl, a phrase laced with such quiet violence it cuts deeper than any blade. He promises the keys in an hour, turns, and is gone. The thud of his boots echoes down the marble staircase, leaving only her racing pulse and the icy rain lashing the glass. You and I must understand this harsh reality. The most inescapable cages we trap ourselves in never look like prisons at all. They are lined with velvet, built upon the quiet compromises we make when we have nowhere else to run. The camera lingers on Elena as she watches the wet street below. Strangers hurry under dark umbrellas, completely blind to the tragic bargain she just struck high above their heads. Her legs finally give out, and she collapses onto a mattress so thick and soft it feels like a terrible lie. A stark contrast to her old smoke-stained apartment. Yet, in the soft amber light of the bedside lamp, she notices a silver frame. Inside, a faded photograph shows a woman with tired eyes holding a young boy, completely joyful outside this very building. It brings a quiet ache to the silent room. The sorrow we try so desperately to outrun often waits for us in the most beautiful places. The ghosts that haunt us longest do not rattle chains. They simply wait quietly in the polished rooms we foolishly mistake for a safe haven. Watch how the silver frame rattles against her palm. The innocent boy, smiling in the photograph, shares the exact same dead, obsidian eyes as the syndicate boss who just purchased her existence. But the true horror rests quietly behind the glossy paper. Elena slips out a thick piece of ivory cardstock, reading Alessandro Vitale, Private Acquisitions. No phone number, no address. Flipped over, a jagged slash of black ink delivers a sickening promise. Always collect what is owed. She recoils, shoving the card back into the frame as if it might burn her flesh, her breathing shallow and frantic. It is a sobering lesson we must all learn. The most brutal monsters do not hide under the bed. They hide their cruelty behind quiet, generous promises, successfully convincing us their absolute control is the only way we will ever survive the freezing storm. The camera pans across the shadows of the room. Every fiber of her being begs her to bolt into the icy rain. But the ink on the contract is dry, and the cold streets show no mercy. She has dragged her shattered life straight into a golden cage. Right on schedule, an envelope slides under the front door with a soft scrape. Inside sit 3 heavy brass keys. The montage of her night is purely tragic. At midnight, she unpacks her worn clothes. At 2, she scrubs a pristine marble counter until her knuckles ache. By 4, she is curled on the velvet sofa, her hollow eyes locked onto the heavy deadbolt. You and I have seen this before. When sheer desperation grabs hold of the human spirit, it acts like a silent undertow. It quietly pulls us away from safety, dragging us down into dark, suffocating depths we never intended to explore. Morning breaks like a bruise over the city. Pale light bleeds through the heavy velvet curtains, casting shadows across Elena's exhausted face. She has not slept at all. Her hands tremble with frantic energy. Stepping into the clawfoot tub, she lets the water run punishingly hot. Steam fills the lens as she scrubs her skin, desperately trying to wash away the phantom weight of Alessandro's piercing stare. His low voice replays in a maddening loop inside her head. Soon she steps out, armor plating herself in a faded diner uniform and scuffed rubber sneakers. It is a heartbreaking reality of the human condition. We take our most paralyzing terrors and wrap them tightly in mundane, daily routines. We rely heavily on the simple, repetitive mechanics of basic survival to prevent our fragile minds from completely shattering into a million pieces. The camera isolates her reflection in the fogged mirror. Her hollow eyes look out of place against the glowing marble vanity. The cold trek through the damp city streets plays out like a grim survival march. With every step, she actively gaslights her own screaming instincts. She tells herself rich men buy properties and just forget them. She clings to that faded photograph, painting Alessandro as nothing more than a grieving son offering a cheap lease. Pushing through the doors of the diner, the heavy scent of stale coffee wraps around her like a worn blanket. This greasy kitchen has been her only real sanctuary. It is deeply tragic to witness. We will bend to the truth until it violently snaps, ignoring every glaring red flag in our path, just to feel perfectly safe when the wolf is already standing inside our house. Let us step into the frame and look at her world. You and I know the heavy weight of losing someone. Add a mountain of medical debt, and it becomes completely suffocating. Her mother's battle ended with aggressive collectors hunting Elena down, ignoring a fresh grave. Inside the diner, the camera shifts to Rita, a hard, worn waitress with faded red hair. She takes one look at Elena and bluntly calls out her exhaustion. Elena simply nods, moving like a ghost as she ties her apron. Rita is the only person who knows how close Elena came to the streets. Stepping close, she delivers a firm maternal squeeze to Elena's trembling shoulder. It is a powerful reminder for us. We build steel walls to survive our darkest days, yet a single touch of genuine compassion can bring the entire fortress crashing down. Rita points a tired finger toward the corner booth. Elena grabs the heavy coffee pot, forcing a strained smile onto her face. But the second she steps into his orbit, her fragile mask shatters. Sitting perfectly still is a young man, radiating a terrifying coiled energy. His dark suit costs more than Elena earns in 6 grueling months. His dead eyes track her with chilling precision. She tries to keep her voice steady, offering a refill. Instead of answering, the stranger leans back and smoothly breathes her full name. The exact date of her mother's passing, and lists her deepest traumas like a grocery list. The camera pushes in on her rising horror. It is a cruel, undeniable fact of our existence. We can bury our painful history in the dark, but the past is a relentless, starving hunter, and it will always track us down. The stranger's voice is smooth as he details her total isolation. He dissects her loneliness with terrifying precision. Every syllable twists like a blade in her ribs. When he softly whispers her brand new address, her fingers give out. The pot slams onto the table, coffee splashing everywhere. She demands a name. He tilts his head, introducing himself as Luca, Alessandro's enforcer. He gracefully gestures to the empty seat. She stammers, using her shift as a desperate excuse to walk away. Luca just smiles, a cold, empty stretching of his lips. Stick with me here, because the power dynamic is about to violently flip. Luca calmly explains he purchased this diner 30 minutes ago. Her boss is in the back, counting stacks of bills. It exposes a sickening reality. True power never raises its voice to win a fight. It simply opens a checkbook and permanently buys the entire battlefield. The camera whips around from her panicked perspective. The morning rush has vanished. Rita is gone. Through the back office window, she spots her manager cradling a thick envelope of cash, grinning like a lottery winner. The floor drops out from beneath her. Her knees buckle and she collapses into the vinyl booth across from the hitman. Luca's dead eyes gleam. He offers a low word of praise, treating her surrender like a pet learning a trick. Leaning closer, he explains Alessandro sent him to establish the boundaries of her existence. She hides her trembling hands as Luca casually reveals she is now a highly protected asset of the syndicate. He slides a sleek, heavy black phone across the table. We must never forget this dark truth. The absolute worst traps are rarely built from rusted iron bars. They are expertly forged in solid gold, blinding us until the heavy door quietly clicks shut. Luca keeps his voice wrapped in velvet, making the nightmare sound like friendly advice. He notes her old number is already synced to the new hardware. There is only one contact programmed, and she must use it for everything. Elena stares at the phone as if a snake just uncoiled on the table. She whispers a weak refusal, but Luca silences her with a sharp look. His quiet tone makes the threat profoundly paralyzing. When she stammers that she is just a tenant, Luca sighs. He leans forward, his jacket parting just enough to reveal the dull steel of a handgun in a leather holster. He softly explains she is sleeping in the exact bedroom where Alessandro's mother took her final breath. Here is a lesson you and I must carry. When the pieces of our lives align far too perfectly to save us, it is rarely some magical fate. It is usually a hungry predator carefully baiting a trap. The camera rests on Luca. He tilts his head, asking if she understands the dark privilege of her situation. He whispers that men have died for a fraction of Alessandro's attention. The heavy threat hangs thickly in the air. Then he dictates the iron laws of her new reality. No guests, no talking about the building. She must act perfectly normal, while knowing she is constantly monitored. Luca nudges the encrypted phone one final inch across the table. Elena reaches out with numb, trembling fingers. As her skin brushes the metal, the screen suddenly flares to life, illuminating two crisp letters. A and V. Luca stands up, leaving her with the crushing knowledge that the boss sees everything. We are left with a sobering reality. The line between a devoted protector and a ruthless jailer is terribly thin. By the time you realize who holds the key, it is already too late to run. Let us look at how this nightmare is framed together, you and I. The camera lingers on Elena. Her breath shudders as the realization sets in. This protection is nothing but a gilded cage. From the heavy shadows, a voice like velvet and gravel corrects her, calling it love. Alessandro steps into the dim light, moving with the impossible silence of a ghost. Dressed in a flawless charcoal suit, he is the picture of a beautiful monster. With a flick of his wrist, he dismisses his hitman, Luca, who obeys like a loyal hound. Luca leaves a chilling parting warning, sealing her fate. Now, she is utterly alone with the architect of her prison. It is a harsh truth to swallow in this life. Sometimes the suffocating control we fear is just a broken soul trying desperately to show love. Notice the stark visual weight under the buzzing lights of the diner. Alessandro slides into the cracked vinyl booth and the myth of the untouchable kingpin shatters. Elena stares, finally seeing the brutal toll of his dark existence. A jagged white scar maps his throat, and heavy exhaustion is carved deeply beneath his eyes. His hands tell the real story. They are elegant but ruined, textured with silvery lines of shattered knuckles from a lifetime of violence. He watches her paralyzing terror, pouring his coffee with unnerving grace. Fear breeds caution, he murmurs, and caution breeds survival. It is a haunting lesson we all eventually learn. Sometimes the terrifying monsters we try to outrun are the ones who teach us how to endure our hardest nights. The visual contrast in this frame is striking. Elena sits shivering in a sweltering room, forcing her trembling voice to stay steady as she asks what he truly wants. Alessandro studies her over the rim of his cup. He admits softly that he is still figuring out his own dark motives. But the second she challenges him, the dynamic shifts. He turns the psychological blade, interrogating her about her mother. The emotional whiplash hits hard. She breaks down, confessing the grim reality of stage 4 cancer and the isolating months she spent as a child caretaker while her father vanished like a ghost. It is a quiet, brutal truth about human grief we all must face. Deep emotional trauma never actually fades away. We simply build stronger muscles over time to carry the unbearable weight. Caught completely off guard, her eyes wide with panic, Elena demands to know why her past matters. Alessandro leans forward, delivering a masterstroke of psychological terror. His voice drops as he reveals his own mother died in that very same apartment. She breathed her last breath Elena now sleeps in. When she tearfully argues he should have told her, he shatters the illusion of her free will. Would she really have turned down a safe roof while holding a final eviction notice? Poverty left her no choice. He slides a thick stack of $100 bills across the table, issuing a cold command to go home and fill her empty refrigerator. It reveals a terrifying reality about survival. Our deepest, most desperate vulnerabilities will always be exposed to anyone who holds the power to exploit them. We need to look closely at the terrifying intimacy of his obsession, you and I. This syndicate leader has mapped out her entire biological rhythm. He tracks her skipped meals and restless sleep cycles like a dark researcher. He breathes her name with a tone he's suspended between pure seduction and absolute command, warning her that she is no longer invisible. By living in his territory, she is now a marked target in a vicious underworld. He leans in close, wrapping her senses in the heavy scent of crushed cedar and gunsmoke. Elena feels a sickening horror, not from his threat, but from her own twisted attraction to it. It is a bitter pill for anyone to swallow. The toxic danger we are taught to flee is often the exact chaotic fire a profoundly lonely heart secretly craves the most. Maintaining unrelenting eye contact, he issues a dark mandate. He frames his possessiveness as a necessary survival tactic, demanding to know if anyone even dares to look at her. His smile flashes like a drawn blade, devoid of warmth. Adjusting his tailored cuffs with the slow grace of an apex predator, he dictates his laws. She must lock herself away, answering only to his courier after a specific 3-knock code. As he turns his broad shoulders to leave, Elena betrays her own survival instincts. She blurts out a fragile question asking when he will return. The immediate flush of shame on her cheeks is tragic to watch. It proves a dark truth about us all. The human mind enters its most dangerous state when it begins seeking comfort inside the cold shadow of a monster. Elena frantically tries to build a wall, hiding behind the mundane logic of her lease. Alessandro simply pulls on his black leather gloves. Finger by finger, he dismantles her defense softly, whispering that the contract exists entirely on his terms. Then he delivers the kill shot. He casually instructs her to straighten the framed photograph sitting on her private nightstand. The horrifying implication freezes her blood. He smoothly confesses her sanctuary is rigged with hidden cameras, framing this violation as an act of profound protection. He dares her to learn the difference between a guardian and a warden. It illustrates a grim reality of our nature. We will eagerly surrender our freedom for a false sense of safety, convincing ourselves the iron bars of our cage are actually a shield. With that exit, the crime boss dissolves into the night. Elena is left anchored to illicit cash and a cheap burner phone pulsing with danger. The next 3 weeks blur into a surreal thriller. Her exhausting grind at the diner shifts in strange ways. Her manager abruptly stops giving her the grueling closing shifts, a quiet proof of Alessandro's invisible financial chokehold. When her co-worker Rita asks questions, Elena builds a desperate wall of lies, painting her dark landlord as a boring, ordinary man. Alessandro is now a phantom, shifting the fabric of her reality from the cold shadows. The hidden truth here carries a heavy weight we must recognize. Keeping dark secrets creates an intense emotional isolation, a heavy iron chain slowly dragging you far away from the normal world. Let us examine the brilliant tension of this silent burner phone together. It sits on her nightstand like a sleeping snake, suddenly illuminating the dark with cryptic midnight messages. He warns her to avoid specific train lines. The suffocating horror sets in when those vague warnings manifest as bloody news headlines days later. Elena realizes with cold dread that this man does not predict the future. He actively orchestrates the violence. Physical encounters are rare. She only catches fleeting glimpses of his blacked-out sedan, or feels his brooding gaze from the darkest booth of the diner. He watches her like an apex predator. It leaves us with a chilling lesson about authority. True, absolute power never once has to raise its angry voice to force an entire room into total, trembling submission. Their third encounter is a masterclass in silent intimidation. Dragging herself into the bleak lobby, she spots him slipping out of a fortified apartment. One fleeting lock of dark eyes, a microscopic nod, and he vanishes into the shadows. But the true tragedy hinges on their fourth meeting. It is a bitterly freezing Tuesday night. Elena is running on pure physical depletion after an agonizing double shift. Every muscle screams. She grips her keys tightly between her frozen knuckles, a pathetic shield against the rotten underbelly of the city. She is completely hollowed out, begging for the temporary death of sleep. It highlights a brutal law of our fragile existence. The most life-altering chaos will always choose to ambush us in the exact second our psychological armor is stripped entirely away. The second her foot hits the landing, the quiet illusion of her safe building shatters. A sudden violent eruption of rapid fire, Italian spills into the dark hallway. Elena knows she should run, honoring the rules of prey, but the terrifying authority in Alessandro's voice paralyzes her. His tone is stripped of charm, replaced by a lethal, icy rage as he tells a crying man named Franco that betrayal carries a final price. The pathetic begging is silenced by a dense, sickening thud of dead flesh hitting the hardwood. A suffocating silence swallows the corridor. Elena stands frozen in the shadows, her own heartbeat deafening in her ears. It is a terrifying lesson we cannot ignore. When you walk through a world populated by hungry wolves, a single second of morbid curiosity will easily become your final mistake. Her terror betrays her. The metallic clink of her keys against the banister rings out through the bloody silence like a gunshot. The shift in Alessandro's voice is deeply chilling. He drops into a terrifyingly calm register, casually whispering that they have a witness. The thunderous approach of heavy boots breaks her paralysis. She sprints upward, the corridor stretching out like a nightmare. Her sweat-slicked hands violently fumble with her lock. She slams the deadbolt home mere seconds before the footsteps reach her door. She retreats into the pitch-black kitchen, gasping for oxygen like a drowning victim. We have all tasted that visceral, freezing fear in our lives. When pure primal panic takes the wheel, it obliterates all logic, leaving us with nothing but the desperate, blinding urge to survive the long night. Let's step into this scene together, you and I. The camera lingers on Elena in the dim apartment. She thinks of calling the police, but the financial chains binding her to this killer are already forged. 3 heavy knocks rattle the cheap wood, the signal. Alessandro's voice slips through the gaps, smooth, demanding entry. When she stammers a refusal, he begins a cold, 3-second countdown. Whispering, it would be a pity to ruin his late mother's favorite door. Her mind fractures. Trembling, she slides the deadbolt, preferring the monster at the threshold over a violent intrusion. He waits in the hallway shadows, perfectly calm. The lesson here is brutal, but undeniably true. Sometimes we willingly open the door to our own ruin just to fool ourselves into believing we still hold the keys. He steps into the pale light, perfectly framed in a dark tailored suit, carrying the scent of vetiver and unspoken violence. He looks like an untouchable kingpin, but Elena's terrified eyes catch a fatal detail. He washed up, yet fresh blood remains caked deep in his cuticles. He issues a quiet order, and the door shuts with the awful finality of a tomb. The reality of the blood hits her, and her knees give out completely. But here the scene twists. Instead of hurting her, the monster kneels. He presses a shockingly gentle, freezing hand against her pulsing throat, pacing her rapid breaths. It serves as a sobering reminder. Pure terror can instantly strip away our deepest instincts, making us forget how to perform the simple, vital act of taking a breath. Towering over her, he directs her breathing like a dark, meticulous conductor. In through the nose, out through the mouth. When Elena finally scrapes together the courage to ask if he killed the man, the camera holds steady on his face. There is no desperate denial. He simply whispers yes. He shrugs off his jacket, sinking into the shadows to displace the grim mechanics of his world. Franco was stealing. Where Elena sees a horrific murder, Alessandro paints a portrait of necessary duty. He merely removed a traitor who broke their blood-soaked laws. Watch his calm posture closely. It warns us of a vital truth. The fastest way to invite darkness into your own soul is by searching for rational excuses to justify the unforgivable actions of a monster. The lighting grows stark as Elena stares at this beautiful killer, frantically searching his expression for a single drop of human guilt. She finds nothing but the cold calculation of an apex predator. Expecting to be his next victim, she holds her breath. Instead, Luca leans forward, resting his elbows on his knees, pinning her with his gaze. He commands her to erase the entire night from her mind. In the vicious economy of the underworld, total ignorance is the only currency that purchases survival. It is a bitter pill, but sometimes the truth does not set you free. It only paints a bright red target on your back. To survive the encroaching pack of wolves, she has no choice but to desperately cling to the very monster she fears the most. The dramatic tension in the room is thick enough to suffocate them. The silence in her apartment feels like the ringing in your ears after a gun goes off. While Elena shakes, Alessandro delivers a freezing dose of reality. The syndicate cleaners sweeping the city for witnesses are absolute savages. Men who make his violence look like mercy. She only wanted a quiet life. Yet fate has a tragic way of extracting a bloody toll for the peace we crave. Pacing to the window, he stares out at the Boston skyline and declares that no one touches what belongs to the boss. When she fiercely whispers she is not his property, he slowly turns. His dark eye burns with a deeply toxic obsession. Whether she likes it or not, his terrifying name has just become her only bulletproof vest. Elena tries to anchor herself, arguing that accepting his protection does not mean signing away her soul, but the boss refuses her that illusion. In 3 slow strides, he crosses the room, forcing her to tilt her chin up to meet his pitch-black gaze. He calls her bluff, asking why a smart woman has not already vanished. When she stammers, she has nowhere to run. He softly tears the lie apart. The tragic reality of our nature is that we will often choose the monster right in front of us over the unknown shadows we cannot see. Normal men treated her like a ghost. But this killer looks at her like she is the only thing breathing in the room. He raises his hand, letting his fingertips hover a fraction of an inch from her jaw, turning the silence into a weapon. Let's watch her body language carefully here. He coldly points out the electric tension between them, whispering that this twisted connection is the only reason she is still alive. Elena is trapped in a mental collapse. Her logic screams to run, but human biology is a devious trickster. Too often, our primal survival instincts put on the mask of deep desire, pulling us blindly toward the fire. She catches herself leaning into his dangerous warmth, craving the very hands she should fear. When she asks what he wants in return, his answer is a quiet masterclass in psychological control. He orders her to forget the violence, go to sleep, and pretend tomorrow is normal. Slowly brushing her lower lip, he swears that, whatever happens next, no one else will ever touch her. The camera pushes in, capturing the exact second her spirit shatters. When Elena demands to know how he can keep her safe, Alessandro does not blink. He promises, in a voice like broken glass, that anyone who steps near her will die screaming. He wears his identity as a ruthless monster with pride so long as he guards his territory. Before her mind can build another wall, he closes the distance, crashing his mouth over hers and twisting his fingers deep into her hair. It is a tragic truth that rigid morals can crumble to dust. The second desperate passion takes over. She should have fought him. Instead, in a beautifully doomed frame, she kisses the architect of her nightmare, letting out a fractured sigh that hovers between helpless protest and absolute surrender. The lighting dims as his hand slides down her waist, crushing her against his chest. To Elena, he tastes of aged whiskey and sheer, intoxicating danger. Every terrified nerve in her body catches fire. For one reckless beat, the blood on his hands ceases to exist. We must always remember that human beings are at their most vulnerable the very moment they allow themselves to forget the things that should terrify them. Her hands twist into his lapels, holding onto the hurricane. Then, without warning, Alessandro violently rips himself away. His chest heaves in the shadows. His dark eyes are a terrifying war between savage hunger and iron discipline. Dropping his voice to a ragged whisper, he tells her to sleep, ordering her to throw the deadbolt the second he leaves. Backing into the hallway shadows, he issues a sharp command to keep the lock thrown against the world. He smooths his jacket, but the camera catches a faint tremor still vibrating in his hands. He tells her to keep her phone close, to call him if a floorboard creaks. She manages a fragile nod, and he quietly calls her a good girl. It is a manipulative stroke designed to make her feel completely possessed, yet safe. He then announces he will collect her for dinner tomorrow at 7. She stammers an excuse about her shift, but he coldly replies he has already erased it. Real power never asks for permission. It just rewrites the world to suit its needs. His dark eyes rake over her trembling frame one last time before he whispers his final order. Wear something beautiful. The heavy door clicks shut, sealing Elena inside the deafening quiet of her apartment. The sharp taste of him still burns against her mouth like a brand. Shaking uncontrollably, she slides the deadbolt twice, her legs barely carrying her to the bathroom mirror. The face staring back at her is a stranger. Her lips are bruised, her skin flushed with a dangerous fever. It is terrifying how a single collision with fate can shatter the foundation of who we think we are. She no longer looks innocent. She looks like a woman marked by the underworld. Suddenly, the light of her phone cuts through the dark. A text from Alessandro, waiting on the freezing street below. He tells her to sleep, promising to sit in the shadows until the sun rises, and her safety is absolute. In this film, this is the beat where the internal alarms would scream. A rational mind would feel trapped with a mob boss circling the perimeter. But look closely at the twisted psychology unfolding here. Absolute control, when painted as protection, is a lethal narcotic rather than panic, a toxic warmth around Elena's chest, like a leash made of silk. Drained to her marrow, she falls onto the mattress in her clothes, clutching the phone like a raft. The camera fades, opening on morning sunlight, slicing through the blinds. For a second, she prays the blood and the kiss were just a nightmare. Then the heavy scent of dark espresso fills her lungs. She slowly turns her head. A steaming porcelain cup sits perfectly placed on her nightstand. He had already been back inside. The heavy gravity of reality collapses. He had slipped past her deadbolts, standing in her sanctuary while she slept, completely defenseless. You and I must look at this and recognize the terrifying weight of that vulnerability. He was close enough to hear her breathing, leaving the porcelain without a sound. Now, her fingers tremble violently against the fine china. The coffee is flawless, exactly how she takes it, because men like him make it their ruthless business to know everything. A thick card rests nearby, his sharp handwriting demanding her presence at dinner. A wise woman would have bolted for the fire escape. But the human heart is a dark puzzle. We often find ourselves hypnotized by the very things that threaten to ruin us. She simply sits in the quiet room and drinks his coffee. We open on a tragic frame of desperation. Elena stands frozen before a dim closet, holding only threadbare fabric and the suffocating black dress she wore to bury her mother. She teeters on the absolute edge of ruin. Then the silence shatters. Her phone glares in the dark, a direct command from the syndicate boss, forbidding argument and demanding she look outside. She drifts to the door, moving with the reluctant grace of a woman in a gothic nightmare. On the threshold rests a pristine white box, bound elegantly in a dark, heavy ribbon. Her pulse thuds wildly against her ribs. There is a brutal truth we must all face. Pride becomes an impossibly heavy stone to carry when your hands are completely empty. Sometimes, mere survival requires you to surrender and untie the dark ribbon. Every rational instinct Elena has screams at her to back away. Accepting a gift from a man forged in blood crosses a terrifying, irreversible threshold. You and I have both lied to ourselves about where the point of no return actually is, haven't we? Yet her trembling fingers slide the ribbon free. Beneath the tissue rests a staggeringly heavy, flawless emerald silk gown tailored to the exact curve of her spine. Hidden beneath its folds lie dagger-sharp, black heels and a velvet case holding gold and emerald studs. It is a breathtaking, devastating display of power. The grand lesson of human nature remains timeless. True temptation never approaches looking like a monster. It arrives, draped in flawless silk, quietly slipping past every defense we have ever built. The emeralds are magnificent but terrifying. An extravagant gesture from a crime boss is never simply a gift. It is a loaded psychological trap, demanding surrender. Her phone's cold glow pierces the room. Alessandro notes the green perfectly mirrors her eyes, a detail he ruthlessly memorized during their first collision. Her thumbs shake as she types that it is too much. His reply is a chilling masterclass in manipulation. He casually reminds her it is only silk, not a wedding band, daring her to wear it, while subtly threatening to come upstairs himself. She spends the day suffocating in a mental fog, haunted by the memory of him kissing her like she was his only oxygen. The harsh reality we must accept is this: the most fatal traps in life are the ones we desperately want to step into. As 6 o'clock chimes, a cinematic metamorphosis begins. Let's look at this piece by piece, shall we? She stands under a scalding shower, washing away the grit of her invisible life. With makeup left bare, she lifts the emerald silk. It cascades over her shoulders like liquid glass, mapping the curves she spent months beneath oversized coats. The moment her foot meets the sharp, black heels, her posture shifts. She radiates a dark, commanding gravity. As the gold studs catch the low light, she stares at a breathtaking stranger in the mirror. It is a masterful rebirth. This teaches us something profound. Sometimes we must put on an elaborate disguise just to finally meet the exact person we were always meant to be. The woman in the glass is a formidable force, a version of herself the brutal streets had buried. True elegance is the iron resilience of the surface, catching up to the iron resilience of the soul. At 2 minutes to 7, 3 deliberate knocks echo through the apartment. She opens the door to find Alessandro, looking like a beautifully tailored menace, holding a solitary red rose. As he takes her in, his dark eyes visibly widen. It is a rare human crack in his impenetrable armor. He curses softly, under his breath in awe. When she nervously blames the dress, he steps closer, smelling of rich cedar, and whispers that the silk merely reveals what he has known since day one. The right people will always recognize your worth long before you ever recognize your worth, long before you ever put on the crown for them. The silence in the claustrophobic hallway is unbearably dense. He extends the rose, and Elena accepts it, her fingers trembling to betray her panic. As their skin brushes, a violent current snaps between them. You can practically see the rigid tick of his jaw. He gestures toward apartment 2B, where warm light spills into the corridor. This is the exact room where a horrific syndicate execution occurred weeks ago. He has gutted the space, stating with chilling detachment that she will never know what violence lived there. But she remembers the blood, yet she silently takes his arm and steps over the threshold. The hardest truth of human survival is this: sometimes rejecting a dangerous storm feels far more fatal than simply closing your eyes and walking straight into the fire. Stick with me. This is where the psychological game deepens. The space is unrecognizable. The cold ghost of an execution has been erased, replaced by glowing amber lamps and flawless crystal. Elena stands paralyzed, asking if he built this illusion, and he smoothly deflects, noting he has people for such tasks, a quiet flex of his empire. Yet, he pulls out her chair with meticulous old-world manners, claiming he wanted her to feel at ease. She softly asks him why. The simple question genuinely disarms the crime boss. Pouring a dark, rare French vintage, he whispers that she deserves beautiful things. This exposes a tragic human flaw. We are always most vulnerable to sudden kindness when we have spent a lifetime forgetting what it actually looks like. The camera tightens as his voice drops. He observes that every man she has ever known has only drained her, declaring his intention to be the one who gives. Elena's defenses flare, firing back that he doesn't know her. A razor-sharp smirk touches his lips as he toasts to forgotten endings. The silence becomes suffocating as she sips the dark wine. His predatory eyes track her breath. Suddenly, she shatters the illusion, demanding to know about his mother, dragging his blood-stained world onto the crystal table. He goes rigid, warning that murder is not dinner conversation. She snaps back that neither is kissing a tenant after a mob hit. The lesson is absolute. The bitter truth will always demand oxygen, no matter how beautifully you set the table. That accusation hangs over the table like a drawn blade. Elena's breath catches, realizing she pushed a ruthless boss to the edge. His knuckles turn stark white against his glass, a muscle jumping in his jaw. We brace for the explosion. Instead, the dark tension splinters. He lets out a rich, genuine laugh that feels wild-eyed out of place. Leaning back, he concedes her point, asking what she wishes to know. She quietly asks if his mother was a criminal. The warmth evaporates instantly. His voice turns to ash as he reveals she was a saint, entirely blind to the syndicate. By the time she realized she married a monster, the cage was locked. She tried high run on exactly once and never tried again. Here is a haunting lesson. Love and paralyzing fear are often built using the exact same bricks. In the flickering light, Alessandro looks haunted by generational trauma. He murmurs. His mother endured that nightmare solely to keep him breathing. When Elena, whispers on Apolly, his, hardens, he insists her suffering gave him the ultimate weapons. How to read a room's power, and how to ruthlessly protect what is his. Locking his gaze onto Elena, he declares his mother would have respected her, recognizing a shared, unbreakable strength the world ignores. Before she can process this, his enforcer, Luca, barges in with the food. Luca refuses eye contact, radiating pure hostility. Alessandro smoothly takes the plates and serves the meal himself. Here is a terrifying lesson. The absolute scariest thing about total control is how flawlessly it disguises itself as genuine care. Let's uncover the darkest twist of the night together. Here the romance peels back into a psychological thriller. Serving her plate, he notes she is too thin, adding that his guard reports she barely eats her groceries. Elena's fork stops. Her blood knows her habits. She demands to know how a guard knows her habits. Alessandro leans back with a terrifying smirk, admitting to wiring hidden cameras into her hallway. He claims her apartment is private, but monitors every exit, every bag, every piece of trash. As she panics, he leans forward, framing this violation as absolute protection and coldly instructing her to learn the difference. They finish the meal in deafening silence. You and I must remember this truth. A golden cage is still a cage, no matter how beautifully the food is plated. The camera tightens on Elena. Her trembling hands betray a confusion she cannot swallow. She begs for the truth. Why her? He has 1,000 women molded to this blood-soaked reality. So why drag an outsider into the dark? Alessandro lowers his silver fork, the metal clinking loudly. Shadows wrap around his broad shoulders. He remembers how she stared at that blood-stained room on her first day, looking at it like a desperate sanctuary. His scarred hands, when he asked her name. He points out that when he first asked her name, she flinched, bracing for a strike. He swears to be the one man who refuses to break her. It is a tragic truth of our humanity. The deepest, most agonizing wounds will always recognize each other, no matter the distance. We push in closer, capturing a moment of profound psychological tension. Alessandro leans across the table, his voice a low murmur. He offers her a kingdom, swearing to build her a palace, instead of tearing down her fragile life. Elena feels a cold dread wash over her. She counters that his obsession is not love, but a suffocating hunger for possession. Yet, in the dark corridors of his world, love and ownership are indistinguishable. He promises to teach her the difference, forcing his violent protection upon her out of a twisted, unyielding honor. It brings us to a quiet, unsettling truth. When a dangerous man builds you a golden cage, the actual trap is never the heavy iron lock on the door. The real trap is the terrifying, undeniable comfort you eventually find inside. Let us look at this piece by piece, shall we? Their dinner plays out like a slow, hypnotic waltz. They trade stories of isolated childhoods, quietly ignoring the invisible blood staining his hands. In a strange twist of fate, they discover a shared obsession with tragic literature. He wields his dark charm with lethal precision, offering a dry humor that reads her soul. Elena sits in silent awe, terrified by how effortlessly she could surrender. By 9 o'clock, his massive silhouette absorbs the dim hallway light outside her bedroom door. Instead of claiming her lips, he presses a tender kiss to her forehead, sealing a silent contract. It leaves a haunting lesson for us all. We rarely run from the devil with the flawless manners of a gentleman with the flawless manners of a gentleman. The fragile illusion of the evening shatters instantly. A deafening explosion detonates below, violently rattling the window glass. Before Elena can draw a breath, the romantic lead vanishes, replaced by a ruthless predator. Alessandro slams her against the plaster wall, shielding her with his massive body, as a heavy pistol gleams in his grip. Luca crashes through the splintered door, his tailored shirt painted with fresh blood, gasping that the rival Antonelli family has breached the perimeter. Alessandro does not panic. His jaw tightens, his expression hardening into an icy calm as he calculates the coming slaughter. It proves a visceral truth. When the fires of chaos ignite, our polite masks burn away, leaving only the raw, undeniable core of exactly who we are meant to be. Luca gasps that 8 armed assassins are sweeping the lower floors. Alessandro absorbs the grim mathematics without a flinch. A second blast ruptures the corridor, plunging the penthouse into darkness. In the pitch black, Alessandro crushes Elena against his chest, and she feels the frantic rhythm of his heart. This ruthless leader, a man forged in violence, is paralyzed by the sudden terror of losing her. He issues harsh commands, demanding total obedience because her survival depends on it. Numb with shock, she simply nods. He seizes her hand, declaring they must reach the roof so Luca can smuggle her out. It unearths a crucial realization. True survival is never about fighting every war that finds you. Real strength is possessing the quiet wisdom to know exactly when to run. Panic consumes Elena as she demands to know his plan. Alessandro turns to ice. Declaring he is staying behind, he shoves her toward Luca, but in a sudden fracture of restraint, he pulls her back. He claims her lips in an agonizing kiss, heavy with unspoken grief. Staring into her eyes with raw torment, he delivers a staggering decree. If the shadows claim him tonight, his entire criminal empire and wealth become hers. She shatters, pleading with him to reconsider, but he dissolves into the smoke, commanding her to never look back. Luca pulls her away into the dark stairwell. It paints a devastating portrait of devotion. Sometimes, the most tragic manifestation of love a broken soul can ever offer is the absolute destruction of themselves just to keep you safe. Stick with me, because the cold reality is setting in. The stairwell echoes with deafening gunfire. Luca hisses at Elena to abandon her heels. She kicks them aside, her bare feet striking the freezing concrete. From below, the symphony of violence reaches a crescendo. Alessandro barks a command in Italian, followed by an agonizing scream that is cut off. Elena sobs that he is walking into his grave. Luca strikes her with the harsh truth, insisting the boss will slaughter every man down there, provided he is not distracted by her. They burst through the roof door into the biting chill, the glittering skyline sprawling before them. It reveals a haunting reality. The massive world remains entirely blind to the bloody, private tragedies unfolding quietly in the shadows. Luca drags her across the sharp roof gravel toward the precipice. A terrifying 4-foot chasm of darkness separates them from the next building. Elena recoils in horror, digging her bare feet into the loose stones. But Luca is unrelenting. He seizes her shoulders, forcing her to face the cold reality. Alessandro is not a victim. He is the apex predator of the syndicate, a man forged in decades of blood. Luca insists the assassins below are dead men walking. Yet, if Elena is caught, her capture will shatter the Kingpin's lethal focus and seal his fate. It illuminates a deeply uncomfortable truth. Sometimes, our frantic desire to stay and save the people we love becomes the exact distraction that ultimately guarantees their complete destruction. The icy wind rips tears from her cheeks as she refuses to abandon the man bleeding for her. Luca is her desperate at bargaining, pacing the ledge to measure the abyss. He commands her to leap, forbidding her from looking down. Gathering momentum, Luca sprints and launches across the divide, landing gracefully on the opposing concrete. He pivots, screaming over the wind for her to follow. But Elena remains rooted, genuinely considering a suicidal return, just to perish beside the boss. Luca spots the hesitation and weaponizes her love, bellowing that staying is an absolute death sentence for Alessandro. It leaves us to ponder a profound reality. Often, the truest form of courage we can display is simply closing our eyes and blindly hurling ourselves into the unknown. Luca's voice slices through the gale, stripping away her illusions. He demands to know if she is prepared to be the weapon that ends Alessandro's life. The words strike her like a physical blow. You and I must pause and understand the weight of this. A suffocating blanket of guilt will always bind us far tighter than the sharp sting of physical terror. That crushing guilt shatters her paralysis. She backs up, breathless, forcing her battered legs into a sprint. For one agonizing heartbeat, she is suspended over the fatal drop. She crashes into the gravel, and Luca hauls her up with a murmur of respect. They scramble down the fire escape, her torn feet leaving smears of red. Just as they reach the alleyway, the building above is consumed in a catastrophic eruption. The night air is shredded by the rhythm of weapons and shattering glass. Elena refuses to picture the grisly fate befalling her protector. They hit the slick alleyway, choking on the scent of ozone and cold rain. Luca works his phone, and an unmarked sedan slides from the shadows. He issues directives to the driver to bury her in a secure location. It brings a profound tension to the surface. While blind passion inspires reckless sacrifices, true loyalty requires the agonizing discipline of stepping away. The enforcer pauses, his jagged edges softening for a second. He swears upon his soul that Alessandro will find her when the ash settles. But Elena collapses into the leather seat, asking the one question that haunts her. What happens if he never makes it out alive? Luca's expression remains carved from stone. He promises with absolute certainty that Alessandro will survive. He confesses he has fought beside the man since they were boys and has never seen his boss look at a soul the way he looks at her. He vows that Alessandro would gladly reduce heaven and hell to ash just to find his way back. You and I must look at this together and realize a vital truth. Genuine devotion is never whispered in the safety of a room. It is forged when you are actively marching into the inferno. Delivering his promise, Luca charges straight back into the screaming maw of the gunfight. As the heavy car accelerates, Elena presses her hands to the glass, watching the building recede, lit only by the terrifying flashes of muzzle fire consuming the upper floors. Let us look closely at this opening frame together, as it perfectly sets our tragic stage. The camera pans across a freezing Cambridge safehouse, where Elena paces the scarred floorboards. Her emerald gown looks like a mocking costume in this sterile room. Outside, an armed driver sweeps the dark perimeter. She grips the heavy telephone, her knuckles stark white, praying for a sign that Alessandro is still alive while he fights a brutal war. 1 hour bleeds painfully into 3, and the suffocating quiet of this underworld becomes agonizing. Finally, at 1:47 in the morning, the dead air fractures with a sudden noise. It reminds us of a quiet, universal truth. In moments of profound crisis, the helpless's waiting is always heavier than the war itself. The ringing telephone violently shatters the heavy quiet of the room. Elena answers before the first ring even finishes, her hands shaking so hard she can barely hold the receiver. Hearing Alessandro speak in that exhausted, hollow voice makes her emotional walls completely collapse. She frantically asks if he took a bullet, but he brushes the panic aside. With a chilling calm, he states the threat is neutralized. There is a profound tragedy in hearing the man you love discuss a slaughtered hit squad like a simple business transaction. He orders her to stay hidden until dawn, but she weeps into the phone, begging to see his face to prove he survived the night. We often forget a very basic human reality in these dark moments. True relief only comes when we physically touch the people we love. Alessandro drops his voice into a dangerously low whisper through the static, asking what she truly wants. She begs him to just be safe by her side. A heavy silence follows, filled entirely by his ragged breathing. He swears he will arrive by dawn and tells her to sleep, but sleep is a luxury only the peaceful get to enjoy. Her mind remains an absolute war zone. The line goes dead, leaving Elena completely frozen. She ignores the food quietly offered by her guard, curling up under a forgotten blanket. The camera lingers as she watches the windows shift from pitch black to a bruised gray, and finally to a pale morning blue. At 6:23, a sudden noise shatters the stillness. This quiet scene reveals a harsh lesson. When you are powerless to help the person you love, time becomes your absolute cruelest enemy. A sharp knock echoes through the room. The guard checks the peephole, stepping aside to let Alessandro walk in. Pay close attention to this visual contrast with me, because it is striking. He looks like he crawled straight out of a brutal nightmare. His tailored suit is shredded and soaked in dark blood. A nasty gash rests over his eye, and violent bruises paint his jaw. He favors his ribs with every painful step, but he is breathing. Elena stands in an absolute daze, letting her blanket drop to the floor as she stares at the grim Reaper himself. Recognizing the weight of this silent reunion, the driver quietly slips out the door. It teaches us a profound truth about vulnerability. When the heavy armor of our defenses finally falls away, when only the barest honesty remains. 8 men, Alessandro whispers into the quiet room. A rival family sent an elite death squad to steal his empire. He asks if she knows their fatal mistake, and Elena simply shakes her head. They assumed having something to lose made him weak. Dragging his battered body across the floor, he explains they completely misunderstood the fractured mind of a desperate man. Finding someone to love does not make a dangerous man softer. It gives him a brutal reason to bare his teeth. When those assassins breached his walls, and he realized they might touch her, his violent purpose became clear. We learn something powerful from this dark psychological shift. Love does not always calm the storm inside of us. Sometimes it becomes the very lightning that strikes our enemies down. Alessandro lifts his bloodied hand, cupping her pale cheek with bruised knuckles. He looks into her eyes and states that he wants absolutely everything. He demands her mornings, her nights, her fears, forced and her blind trust. He freely admits he is not a good man, promising to commit worse sins just to keep her breathing. We naturally look for knights in shining armor, but sometimes the only one who can save you from the wolves is a darker wolf. He offers a shadow world where she will never be invisible again. As tears wash down her face, Elena chokes out that his promise sounds like a beautiful gilded cage. The lesson buried in her tragic fear is profound. Total security always demands a heavy price, and absolute safety can very easily feel exactly like captivity. He leans in and presses his forehead against hers, his tired breath ghosting over her lips. "No," he murmurs, "it is a fortress, and she would be its queen, not its captive." He lays out his terms with heartbreaking vulnerability. If she wants to work, she can. The only absolute rule is her unconditional safety. If she walked away right now, it would destroy him. But she would still keep her freedom and his protection. He pulls back just an inch, his dark eyes searching her soul. With a rough catch in his throat, he admits his final truth. He was desperately hoping she would choose to love the monster anyway. This reveals a fragile reality about human connection. A true partner never attempts to clip your wings. Instead, they build a massive sky where nothing can ever shoot you down. Elena stares into the exhausted eyes of this beautifully dangerous man. He just slaughtered a hit squad to protect her, offered her a kingdom, and kept his violent promises. Every logical nerve in her body screams to run from the bloodshed trailing him. Stick with me here, because you and I both know the brain and the heart rarely agree on survival. Her treacherous heart simply begs to stay. When she asks about the rival families plotting to strike again, Alessandro refuses to soften the blow. He can minimize the daily chaos, but he can never erase the heavy crosshairs painted on his back. The tragic lesson in this moment is unavoidable. When you choose to deeply love a complicated person, you must also willingly accept the brutal shadows that constantly follow them. She asks the final, heaviest question of the night. If she actually chooses him, what happens next? His bruised hand tightens against his pale skin, vowing she will become completely untouchable. Anyone who dares cross her path will face a terrible fate. She would wear his ring, carry his dangerous name, and be woven into his dark syndicate. Elena's breath hitches at the mention of a ring, and Alessandro's hard expression instantly softens. He promises it will only happen when she realizes this is not just some toxic obsession. He struggles to find the right words. Admitting his violent devotion is the closest thing to love a shattered man can offer. We must remember a difficult truth about affection. Broken people rarely speak the traditional language of romance, but their fierce loyalty is entirely unbreakable. The heavy tension breaks as Kara does the unthinkable. She reaches up her trembling hand, covering Alessandro's ruined knuckles, torn from the violence he just committed in her name. Anyone else would have run from the blood. Instead, she turns her head and gently kisses his battered palm. Suddenly, his mouth is crashing down onto hers, desperate and tasting sharply of iron. She pulls him closer by his torn shirt, completely ignoring his sharp wince of pain as their bruised bodies collide. When he breathlessly asks if this is a yes, she whispers that she will try to build something real right in the center of his hell. This cinematic moment teaches us a remarkable lesson. Sometimes, the most authentic love is never found in the easy light, but is fiercely forged in the absolute darkest of places. He kisses her again, the wild desperation finally fading into something incredibly soft. He promises they will figure out the rest of the dark syndicate together. When he pulls back, Kara notices the fresh blood weeping through his shredded shirt, She insists he needs a doctor, but his reply is painfully raw. He just needs sleep, and he needs her, in that exact order. Careful of his split skin, she gently guides him into the shadows of the bedroom. Watching him strip off that ruined suit is a quiet lesson in heartbreak, as every dark bruise tells a violent story across his skin. It serves as a beautiful reminder of our shared human condition. We easily forget how truly vulnerable the most dangerous people are, until they willingly take off their heavy armor for the sake of love. Let us stay in this quiet room because we are unpacking the emotional core of this story together. They lay on top of the cover's kiss. He is stripped to his bruised skin, while Kara remains in that emerald dress, too exhausted to change. Alessandro pulls her flush against his chest, burying his weary face in her hair. Half asleep, he murmurs his deep gratitude, thanking her for choosing to stay. She laces her delicate fingers through his damaged hands. His rough voice fades as sleep takes him, but his protective grip never lets go. Kara, watching the dawn paint the ceiling gold, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. It brings us to a beautiful truth. The most profound and lasting peace usually arrives directly after we survive the absolute worst storms. Pale dawn spills through heavy velvet, illuminating a shattered reality. Look closely at this frame. You and I are stepping into a story that breaks every conventional rule of romance. Kara blinks awake, her life strung tight along a razor wire of constant danger, yet here she rests, anchored by a devotion so pure it aches. Alessandro is, by every metric of society, an absolute monster. But here is the tragic irony. This demon is the only shield keeping the wolves from her door. She wandered in seeking a cheap apartment and tripped into a crime lord's den. 3 months later, she wakes in his Beacon Hill penthouse under a gaze of sheer reverence. The lesson here is simple. Sometimes, the very shadows that should terrify us become the only true sanctuaries our human hearts will ever know. The camera pushes in as she stretches with languid grace. A soft murmur escapes her lips as sunlight strikes the heavy emerald on her hand. He slipped it on 2 weeks ago, not a formal proposal, but a quiet, crushing promise. A plea for her to realize she is no prisoner. With sudden boyish eagerness, Alessandro guides her to his office. Normally, this room breathes the freezing air of a criminal empire. Today, his massive oak desk is shoved into a corner. In the center stands an easel bearing a framed document. It is the deed to 247 Beacon Hill, inked entirely in her name. Take this to heart. Real love never hides behind beautiful, empty words. When you truly care for another human being, you move heaven and earth to secure the very ground beneath their feet. She recoils, breath-catching, as she insists she cannot accept the building. Alessandro silences her. He steps close, wrapping his arms around her arms, downwards around her waist, resting his chin heavily on her shoulder. His voice is a gravelly whisper. If his enemies ever tear down his empire, this deed is her Kyra. Spins in his grip, eyes blazing, as she fiercely swears she is never leaving. A soft smile breaks across the mobster's scarred face. He needs her to hold the power to walk away, just to know she stays by her own free will. She teases that it is simply a beautiful cage. But look closely at this scene with me. Love cannot breathe without true choice. It only carries real, lasting weight when we offer it to someone with entirely open hands. He kisses her temple, swearing this is no prison. He is giving her wings. The choice to fly belongs solely to her. Kara stares at the ink, the tangible proof of her independence. She lifts her gaze to the scarred man before her, a man who has spilled blood just to keep her breathing. He taught her the difference between possessing someone and fiercely protecting them. In the tense quiet, she finally strikes the match. She whispers that she is staying because she is wildly in love with him. Alessandro freezes in absolute shock. She has never spoken those words before. His romance may be steeped in dark shadows, but the lesson is profound. To truly love another is to hold their absolute ugliest flaws up to the harsh light, and fiercely choose them anyway. She stares into the eyes of this ruthless boss and tells him he is enough. The tension snaps. Alessandro pulls her into a crushing embrace, his frame trembling with raw emotion. He rests his forehead against hers, breathing raggedly. He admits he has no talent for soft poetry. Instead, Wall offers a terrifying vow. There is no moral boundary he will not shatter, no brutal price he will not eagerly pay to keep her safe. Kara smiles, calling it a dangerous kind of love, but real love all the same. A rare, fractured laugh escapes him, echoing off the walls. Stick with me, because here is the undeniable truth. The very things the outside world dismisses as hopelessly broken are often the exact pieces we need to make our own fractured souls perfectly whole. The camera circles them as Kara reflects on the chasm between her current self and the terrified girl from 3 months ago. That trembling ghost would never recognize the fierce woman standing here today. But that ghost had never been truly seen, let alone worshipped with such violent devotion. She went hunting for a cheap apartment and unearthed a real home in the darkest trenches of the underworld. She found impossible freedom with a man who held the power to lock her away, but handed her the keys instead. Yes, this freedom is wrapped in armored glass and armed guards, but it is her conscious choice. Consider this undeniable truth about survival. Sometimes the absolute safest place to weather the storm is right in the dead, quiet center of a raging hurricane. Alessandro buries his face in the crook of her neck, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper to beg her back to bed. The outside world can wait. Kara catches his scarred hand, intertwining their fingers. She whispers that the entire world could crumble to ash as long as he remains beside her. He pulls her tight, swearing an oath that she will have him for as long as she draws breath. Completely. Eternally. Wrapped in the unyielding embrace of her beautiful monster, the jagged pieces of her life finally slot into place. She is safe despite the target painted on his back. Let us pause on this profound realization. We spend our lives furiously chasing absolute independence. But the truest freedom is discovering the one person who finally anchors your wandering soul. The camera slowly pulls back. That rundown apartment was merely the opening scene. Kara understands now that her true home was never destined to be built from cold brick and fragile glass. Her sanctuary breathes. It resides in the absolute security of his arms, forged by the heavy weight of his brutal love. She sees the unvarnished reality, acutely aware of the violence shadowing his every step. Yet she chooses this chaos and this terrifying man without regret. As you and I finally wrap up this story, carry this truth forward. Real love rarely arrives wrapped in a neat, perfect bow. Sometimes it shows up bruised, bleeding, and bearing heavy scars. But when that love stands as an iron shield against a freezing, bitter world, you grab onto it with both hands, and you never let go.